Hello and welcome to the CEO Show. I'm your host, Nick Vaidya, and today I bring to you the former CEO of Apple Computers, legendary John Sculley. Sculley is also an entrepreneur and an investor. He has led a very interesting life filled with great challenges. In 1977, he was named the youngest ever president of Pepsi. His highly innovative and successful marketing strategies at Pepsi and then at Apple has earned him the reputation as a global marketing expert. He's currently working on a number of startup companies that use digital technology to produce healthcare-related tools that have the potential to dramatically decrease the $2.5 trillion spent annually on healthcare in the United States. Today, he continues to speak and write about disruptive marketing strategies. He has much to say about the emergence of the third wave companies, the companies that have the ability to transform their products and organizations in response to changes in the economy, social habits, and customer interests. So without waiting any further, ladies and gentlemen, here is John Sculley.
Well, John, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking out the time.
Great. Well, nice to be with you.
John, I want to preface our conversation with a certain concept. You talk about moonshot. Mitch Cohen of Pricewaterhouse talks about self-made billionaire effect. Massive wealth creation that's possible in current environment because of the culmination of many forces and unlike ever before. And these are great ideas. These are great paradigms, and entrepreneurs today need to know about them. There's no doubt. However, everybody's not successful. And lots of entrepreneurs are still looking at, lower hanging fruits, not massive wealth creation, but the mid-sized companies that they end up creating or small businesses that they create. The knowledge is not the missing piece. Knowledge can be acquired. I mean, you've got people like Rita McGrath, who's written a book called Market Busters or 40 Strategies. And there's so many other things that are easily available to entrepreneurs and business people and managers. But something else is missing. So, and that question really I want to ask you is, Henry Ford, when he decided to go for color on his cars, he waited 16 years and refused to put any color other than black and lost 60% of the market share. Those I define as blind spots. And all people have those blind spots. I wanted to get to you is, what were your blind spots? How do you handle blind spots? What do you recommend to people to handle blind spots? Because when it comes to judgment, that's really makes the difference, not so much so the information. So what I want to get to you more details about, those judgment calls. And have you had those blind spots? Have you had a major blind spot that you now recall and say, this is the lesson I learned from that?
Well, you've given me quite an expansive range of questions.
The question really is about your blind spot. Have you had a blind spot that you recall?
I think we've all had blind spots, and I'll give you an example of mine. I came to the high-tech world not as a trained engineer, but I was brought in as an experienced big brand consumer marketer from Pepsi with the expectation that Steve Jobs saw that the personal computer industry was going to go mainstream and it was going to become a lot more than selling computers to technical people, that it was going to be an industry for non-technical people who would have incredible tools to be able to do all kinds of creative things, not just business things. And so my role was to bring big brand consumer marketing to Apple and to Silicon Valley, since we were the first ones in Silicon Valley to focus on consumer marketing. The initial focus I had was to rescue the Apple II brand, which was 6 years old and declining. So that was not a blind spot, nor did it require me to understand much about technology. It meant I had to apply what I'd learned as a consumer marketer. So I was in very safe grounds on that. Even when we introduced the Macintosh, that was still pretty safe grounds because everything technical was being handled by Steve Jobs and the engineers. My job was to help with the building of the brand, building of the business, which we did with our Super Bowl commercial and many things beyond that. But in the early 1990s, when we were looking for something beyond personal computers, and I had been working with some of our most talented technical people, and we all believed that there was going to become something after personal computers with handheld devices. We built the first major revolutionary product in handheld devices called Newton. And my blind spot was that I didn't have the technical understanding to appreciate that an innovation as disruptive as Newton was, and it's where the ARM processor was actually embedded that we have in every mobile device today. But I had a blind spot that I didn't appreciate that timing in life is everything from a technical standpoint. And while we had the right vision, we had a product that pointed the direction of where the future was going beyond personal computers, that we were probably 15 years too early.
And I think you coined the word PDA. You are attributed to coining the word personal digital assistants, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And so the vision was pretty sharp, but what the product could do was relatively limited. And the ability to even do things wirelessly hadn't yet had an infrastructure that was capable of that, because back in the early 1990s, there was no World Wide Web. There were no mobile data services available on cell phones. Cell phones were still analog. They were still not a mainstream product for most people. So we were way, way ahead of things from a timing standpoint. So you could say the blind spot was not fully appreciating the importance of timing as everything.
So, John, I'd like to go a little deeper into the causes of the blind spot. And we know Ron Johnson literally destroyed JCPenney with certain other blind spots. And you were responsible for bringing marketing research, consumer marketing research into Pepsi. I wouldn't say responsible for it, but you brought it into a big way. So those were the blind spots at that time. But when you talk about blind spots technology, is it because of lack of information, lack of understanding, or certain innate desires that you had that clouded your judgment? What was the thing? What was the reason?
I think we are all a creature of our own experience. And one thing I learned when I was working with MIT's Media Lab, which I was involved with for 15 years, that you need to understand things from more than one perspective. It's a multiple point of view that is so important. And I remember Marvin Minsky, who is one of the early creators of artificial intelligence at MIT, used to say, you don't really understand something until you understand it more than one way. And so me coming from the domain of consumer branding, consumer marketing, I understood that field pretty well. And I could apply those ideas to technology. What I didn't understand as well were many of the technical aspects of the computer industry. And this meant that I had a blind spot primarily because I'd just never been exposed to having to be at the forefront of creating a revolutionary product. Remember, the Macintosh was not created by me. It was created by Steve Jobs.
Right. So how do you worry about having other blind spots, or how should entrepreneurs and other executives think about managing their blind spots? Because you talk about cross-pollination of ideas or cross-pollination of domains so that you get multiple perspectives. Makes perfect sense. In fact, most of the innovation that is readily adapted in the marketplace comes from cross-pollination, not really the true scientific research-driven innovation. That's just the budding. That's just the seed. It's the cross-pollination that makes a difference. So obviously we are blindsided in so many ways. How do you manage that now, and what do you recommend to others?
Well, the issue you raise is such an important one, and it's the major reason why I wrote my recent book, Moonshot. I felt that I had learned a lot over many decades of exactly the kind of issues that you're raising, as to how do you make sure that you can see things from multiple points of view and not have a blind spot? How do you take advantage of the groundswell of change that may be going on that you had nothing to do to contribute to, but you may actually be able to ride the wave? And so what I've learned is that you have to have multiple domain perspectives, and that it's being able to connect the dots between multiple domains. For example, why is it that Eastman Kodak, who dominated the photo film business for almost a century, missed the digital photography era? Now, it wasn't because they didn't know about the technology of digital photography. They were actually working on that.
Right.
But they doubled down on film processing at exactly the same time that Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone.
Right.
And what they missed was they had a blind spot. They didn't see that what Apple saw, because Apple had experience now with consumer electronics with the iPod, it had experience with computer user interface with the Macintosh, it had experience with photography, because we had done some of the early digital photography on the Macintosh even back in the 1980s. So they saw something through the eyes of competition. That this is Kodak. They were worried about how do they compete with Walmart, who was becoming as large as Kodak selling film. And they said, we've got to double down on film processing so we can sell our single-use film cameras for an even lower price. What Steve Jobs saw was, he said, hey, there's something going on in the mobile world, and that we're moving from 2G, which was text and email over a mobile smartphone, mobile cell phone, to the ability to do photo quality images with 3G. And so Steve conceived and built a product that took advantage of the domains that he and Apple understood, but added to it the insight that the wireless communication industry was going through a fundamental change that would enable photo quality images to be sent wirelessly. And so 3 years later, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. Apple was dominating the world of the next era of smartphones. So that's an example of why you have to be able to have an insatiable curiosity, be scanning the landscape, and using a technique that I learned from Steve Jobs, which he called zooming. And Steve used to say, you have to zoom out, connect the dots between different domains that may not seem obvious. He saw the domain when we were working together of calligraphy, because he'd studied it at Reed College. Right. He saw the domain of easy-to-use personal computers, because he helped create that with Steve Wozniak with the Apple II. He saw the incredible engineering workstation innovation that was going on at Xerox for technical people, but these are $60,000 workstations that were using a graphic user interface. And he saw the growth of a new printing technology called laser printing. And so he connected the dots and said, I think we at Apple can create something that we later named desktop publishing, which will enable non-technical people to be incredibly creative with a tool that people had thought was for technical reasons or business reasons that may actually be used for creative reasons. And so he was able to zoom out and connect the dots. So that's what zooming is. And then he'd say you zoom in once you connect those dots between those domains, and you simplify. So it was all about simplifying the user experience. Well, those same principles were carried on decade after decade by Apple, by Steve Jobs, with the iPod, with the iPhone, with the iPad. And we've seen that you can take generalized principles and be able to apply them across time, across different opportunities. Now, what I wrote about in Moonshot was not just the stories of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and some of these other incredible geniuses, but what I called the adaptive innovators, meaning the rest of us, those of us who may not be super geniuses, but want to be able to take advantage of the swell of growth in new eras, what I call moonshot. The moonshot in this case was the moonshot metaphor used frequently in Silicon Valley for things like the invention of the web, the invention of Google, the invention of iPhone, the invention of the personal computer. When the world is going to be different afterwards than it was before the moonshot now is the incredible power shift that we're seeing as customers shift their focus from the large incumbent companies who have dominated industries, many cases for decades, to other customers and listening to the opinions of other customers more than they listen to the incumbents. So what that means is that you don't have to be Steve Jobs, you don't have to be Bill Gates or Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg. You can actually be an adaptive innovator, scanning the landscape, looking for ways to connect dots and zoom in, ride waves of technological change. In this case, it's big data analytics, cloud, mobility, and be able to create disruptive businesses that may be incredibly successful, but don't necessarily have to be on the scale of a Google or an Apple or a Facebook.
No, absolutely. I happen to know Regis McKenna, and I believe you probably know him as well. And
Regis is a very talented marketing person and was one of the great innovators in Silicon Valley back in the early days.
Yeah, I worked with his company, Regis the McKenna Group, back in the late 90s.
Yeah. Well, he's a great talent.
He's a great talent. And he used to talk about all the time, talk about the 64,000 feet view. And you have to have the big picture as well as zooming down to specifics. But oftentimes entrepreneurs tend to narrow down too quickly into a problem and start solving it, as opposed to really defining what might the problems be. In other words, when Kodak looked at its competition or looked at its risks, they saw risks that were perhaps too apparent, but did not recognize that the risks were lurking elsewhere that they never thought as risks earlier on.
Well, that's exactly right. And Regis, I'm sure, had an influence on Steve and some of the ideas I was discussing with Steve's methodology of zooming.
Yes, indeed. So, is it possible to use this framework? What you've defined is a great framework. Is it possible to replicate it by a person, or do you think it might be possible to bring a group of people who come from a varied background, different perspectives, and say, let's look at this problem and see how we can connect the dots? Is that possible to do, or is it something difficult? Because people have talked about, you need a genius like Steve Jobs to do what he did, but what's your take on it?
Well, my take on it is that technology is improving at such a rapid rate, but it's commoditizing at a rate we've never seen before. And so it used to be that in Silicon Valley, it was all about inventing the technologies and venture capital firms investing in the technologies. Now you see it's quite different. That it's not the value of the technology that's so important. It's the value of what the technology can do to change the way things are done, to give better products or better services than what's available today. So look at the personal transportation. Uber, of course, is the best recognized example of that. When they went to San Francisco, which had 140 million revenue per year for the taxi industry, and Google came in, and a few years later, they had a 400 million revenue business, because they came up with a cheaper, or not cheaper necessarily, but they certainly came up with a more convenient and easier way to get a taxi at difficult times of the day. While Uber built a $400 million business, the taxi industry didn't go away. The taxi industry is still a $140 million industry. And so what Uber did was to think of a problem in a very different way. They came up with an insight that said, hey, we can use the technology to put together an infrastructure of cars and drivers and be able to create a service that you can access using technology off of your smartphone. But it's not really a technology company. It's a company that uses technology to build a novel infrastructure. We're seeing more and more of that. And I believe that you have to be an expert in something. You don't have to be an expert in everything. And disruption comes by being able to connect the dots between several different domains, which means you need people on your team who are experts at those different domains. Again, things are usually done by teams, not by a single individual. And you don't really have to set such a high mark to say, unless you're Steve Jobs, there's no way you're going to change the future. Just isn't true. There'll always be an opportunity for people like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Page to hit the long ball and to try things that just seem over the top for the rest of us. But there's plenty of opportunity out there to take advantage of the commoditization of accelerating more powerful, more reliable technologies, and to be able to use the technologies and bring together your knowledge of specific domains and say, there has to be a better way to do things than we're done before. And so it is available for the rest of us. And the operative word is adaptive. So it isn't the adoptive word. The operative word is not invent. You don't have to be the inventor.
Adapting towards some inventions.
So you have to have a curiosity. You have to be looking across different domains, seeing that there are different ways to do things, and then you adapt from those domains and maybe from some enabling technology to create a better way to do something. And there's plenty of room to create tens of thousands of new businesses that can be very successful without saying, if I'm not Larry Page, I'm not going to be successful.
Right, absolutely. It's more so, how do you reframe the question? Instead of looking for answers, the approach has to be, how do you define the question differently, coming from different perspectives?
Well, I'll give you an example from my early days when I was first appointed marketing VP of Pepsi. And at that time, Pepsi had been working for years trying to create an attractive glass bottle design that would be more competitive with the incredible, easily recognized, iconic design that Coca-Cola has with what's called the hourglass-shaped bottle. Right. And every time Pepsi tried to come up with a design they thought was pretty good, it always infringed on the Coke copyright, because Coke just had a great, pretty broadly accepted design. It vended in the vending machines, it filled easily in the bottling lines, it was comfortable to hold in your hand, it was iconic to look at. So we were running simultaneous to that an in-home product use test. And at that time, it was the first quantitative market research of this scope that Pepsi had ever done. And we were tracking week after week the behavior of people when we delivered soft drinks. They could choose which ones they wanted. They could buy them from us. We deliver them right to their home. So they could pick Pepsi or Coke or 7-Up or Dr. Pepper or some other product. And then we would come back the next week and give them the same opportunity. We would do this week after week. And what we discovered was that after 9 weeks, 550 homes we were going out to every week, that there was a very clear pattern that was emerging. No matter how much inventory was in the house when we left the previous week, it was always empty the next week. And we thought about that and we said, wait a minute, we make our money selling fluid ounces of beverage. The more ounces we sell, the more money we make. So why are we wasting our time trying to design a little tiny glass returnable bottle? We should be figuring out ways to get containers that are large enough that we can get more inventory of beverage into the household inventory and make it easy and light. And so that led to the development of the 2-liter plastic bottle. And we worked with
an amazing example.
Yeah, and so we said we were asked to solve the wrong question. So asking the questions correctly are more important than the answers. In this era, I think back to when I went to school, everything was about answers. We memorized answers, we looked up answers in the library, we studied answers in our homework. Well, guess what? Answers are for free. You can go to Google on the web. Right. You can go to your online calculator. All these things are pretty easy to get. Answers are not that valuable anymore. What's valuable is asking the right questions.
It's the ability to define questions.
Absolutely. And so once we ask the right question, which is how do we design a package that will get more beverage into the household inventory, suddenly we saw the whole problem differently. And we were out there for 2.5 years ahead of Coca-Cola before they came out with a 2-liter plastic bottle, because they didn't see things differently. They were still thinking, well, we dominate the industry with this beautiful little iconic bottle. Right. And they didn't keep their eyes focused on something new that was emerging, which was this new 2-liter plastic bottle. It was lightweight. Plastic didn't weigh very much. It was biodegradable, didn't break. It wasn't messy in stores. And this happened at exactly the time when 2 new channels were just emerging in the consumer packaged good industry. And one was called drug chains. CVS, Walgreens were just beginning. This is early 1970s. And the other was called mass merchandisers, Kmart, Walmart. And we went to those new channels and we said, would you like to carry our 2-liter plastic bottle? And they said, well, we've never carried soft drinks before because they're too messy. The bottles break. They said, well, try this one. And we dropped it and it bounced. They said, I think we like that. And that was the launch of opening up Pepsi into new channels. So we didn't have to always compete head on against Coca-Cola. We were a much smaller brand in those days, but we could pick the new growth areas. So again, broadening your horizon, expanding your curiosity, connecting dots. Same thing we were doing at Apple, same thing Apple does to this day. We were doing back in those early days at Pepsi in the 1970s.
Yeah, true disruption comes from the cross-pollination. In fact, I also have an academic background, and I moved from business to educational psychology and then to statistics. And looking at these 3 different things, I realized, oh my God, they're using the same concepts with different names, and they're cross-pollinating and creating research articles, which actually has been done maybe 20 years ago in another domain. And
absolutely right. Well, when I was in graduate school, I also studied mathematics as well as business, and I was doing what seemed to me experimental at the time. We were doing Bayesian statistical modeling, Monte Carlo game theory, Markov chain analysis, and I kept saying to myself, well, this is really interesting, but why would anyone ever need to use anything like this? Because the computers weren't very powerful back in the 1960s and 1970s. And yet today, that's where it all is. It's all with big data analytics, using predictive analytics, and all of those tools that were a curiosity back in my academic era are the standards of what we understand today as predictive analytics.
Absolutely. In fact, it makes such a huge difference in consumer behavior in terms of the paradigm shift of buying and consumption. It's completely different from what it was 20, 30 years ago.
Absolutely. And so that's why it's so important to understand that timing is everything, that something that doesn't make sense at one time can turn out to be revolutionary at another moment in time.
And the thing is that it can be predicted to a large extent. If we are cognizant that there is potential for blind spots, and if we go actively and proactively out there to engage with a variety of people to understand really, what might we be missing here, and you can mitigate the risks of going wrong. It's just that people tend not to go outside and tend to be so ethnocentric in their views and then mostly entrepreneurs tend to be there because they take an idea and make it their own. It's almost like a baby. They don't want to let go. And that really creates a little bit of a problem.
Well, there's an interesting tension here because on the one hand, the only reason for a new company to exist is to do something really well that isn't being done by someone who's already an incumbent in the industry. Because the incumbent has the advantage of size, of resources, market position, recognition, things of that sort. So if you're going to try something new, you're going to have to take some risks. You're trying things that still have some unknowns. On the other hand, and you correctly point this out, an entrepreneur is someone who becomes incredibly passionate about something they believe in. And so how do you deal with that tension between you have to take risks, and yet on the other hand, you're passionate about something you believe in and you don't want anyone to touch your baby? And so there's this tension back and forth. And sometimes you can play it too safe and be too passionate about something, and the world's changing around you. So you have to be able to zoom out, look at that landscape. How is it different today than it might have been, a year ago, a month ago?
Right.
Or how will it be different a year from now or 2 years from now? So you need the context of being able to zoom out from time to time and look beyond the industry that you're in, or even the specific problem that you're trying to solve with your product or your service, because a lot of things can change around you, and you don't want to have your Kodak moment.
Now, do you think there's a need for developing a certain kind of culture in organizations? And this obviously happens once the company has become a little bigger than just the entrepreneurial group. But what about culture of an organization? How does it impact innovation?
Well, let me give you two observations. One is that the skills to prove out proof of concept, which means starting from nothing and going to something that you now have evidence works, is very different than the skills that it takes once you know that and you have the evidence that it works to be able to scale that and become an expansion stage company. And so one of the big challenges that entrepreneurs have is, gee, I've got this loyalty to the people who helped me get this far, and now all of a sudden you have to do entirely different things. It's not about inventing something new. It's about, how do I expand? How do I reach out and get the sales channel? How do I attract customers? How do I build a repeatable process? All of these things. So a different set of skills, often requiring some adjustment in culture. Now, separate from that, step back and look at any large organization. And I don't care whether it's a company that's only 10 or 15 years old, or whether it's a company that's been around for many decades. What you find in very large organizations is that middle managers are empowered to say no, not to say yes. Their job is to be able to continue what has made their company successful in the past. So in one sense, they're there to protect as much as they are to promote the advancements forward. And so in large organizations with middle managers given the authority to say no and rarely the authority to say yes. Yes requires going through a set of protocols and processes. Yes requires finding consensus. And yet no is pretty emphatic. So it makes it very hard for large organizations when there's a revolutionary change in an industry to be able to see it and do something about it. For example, take Intel and Microsoft, two of the most successful companies ever in the high-tech world. During the 1990s, with the age of the World Wide Web, the launch of the internet as a commercial service, no two companies benefited from it more than Microsoft or Intel.
Right.
And yet, only a decade later, both of those companies missed the era of mobility.
Right.
And you say, well, how is that possible? They have very smart people. They have all the resources at their beckoning, and yet they both missed mobile. And I think it goes back to large organizations, even the most successful ones, can become victims of their own success. And even very talented people, when they're being measured on things of how do we maintain what we have and improve what we have. For Microsoft, it was Windows. For Intel, it was control of the processor industry for the desktop and laptop computers. You know, how do you get people to think beyond that boundaries of what has made them so successful before? And that's what opens up the opportunity right now, and why I wrote Moonshot, was that we've never had a better chance for disruptors, adaptive innovators, to come in and change the game, even when you have strong incumbents in the market already.
But look at Google, for example. They have proactively, again, gone out and created a culture of innovation, and they gave, I think, 20% of the time for their pet projects and so on and so forth. So is that the kind of approach that you would recommend to large organizations, matured or even growing organizations, to inculcate within their teams, or create separate teams to look beyond the horizon?
Well, I have huge admiration for what Larry Page and his team are doing. But let me put it into some perspective. Google has a monopoly. They are the advertising industry for most of us.
Right.
And so they have this incredible cash machine, which gives them the flexibility to be able to do things that a lot of companies couldn't do. They can still keep their eye on the ball and grow their Google business. They're incredibly innovative. And they're willing to spend money on things that may have no immediate return. And they're willing to make mistakes. Not many companies have that flexibility, nor do they have a leadership that's willing to take those kinds of risks. So I think Google is a great example of leadership that's willing to break new ground even beyond what they have. So all kudos to the Google leadership. But unfortunately, there are very, very few companies in the world who sit in the position with a cash machine like Google has, and have the kind of talent pool that Google has at the top of its organization. So it's a role model more for aspiration, but not an easy one to replicate, I think, for other companies. There are different models you can replicate for other companies, and they tend to be ones that are not inventing new technologies, but they tend to be ones that are adapting. And that's why I think the era of the adaptive innovator, whether it's a small company or a larger company having to adapt to changes in its industry, that adaptation is such a key skill that needs to be better honed by executives.
And one of the good things is that in the current environment, the time difference between a stimuli and a response is so quick that you can develop products and ideas while you're developing, get it tested. You know, the lean startup kind of ideas where you don't have to really pre-plan, not really massive market research. You could adapt and create while you're doing it.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, as an example, my team and I started a mobile smartphone company. We call it the World Phone, for the budget mobile industry. And we saw that the technology on smartphones had so commoditized and yet was so good now that you could actually build high-quality smartphones and sell them for $150. The price points for the leading smartphones in the world are over $600.
Right.
And so to do that and make money, you had to find an entirely different business model. So we said, well, we can't afford to invest in R&D, so we just have to accept that. We can't afford all the market spending that the big brands have, so we have to deal with that. So what can we do? Product design. So we said we can differentiate on product design. We can up the game from what the generic factories in China are producing. We can put better design features around the devices themselves. We can use our marketing experience to target in on a specific consumer, people with not a big budget, but who have the aspirations to have their own smartphones. We can optimize around things that are important in emerging markets. We only sell in emerging markets. So battery life is really key. If you live in Africa, you may have to take a 2-hour bus ride from your work location to your home. And when you get home, there's no electricity. And yet you want to be able to listen to music. You want to be able to check the sports of teams that you like and things of that sort. And so you've got to have much longer battery life than we in the Western world would expect to have, because we can plug in and recharge. So these are the kinds of things you can adapt to without having to reinvent an entire industry like smartphones. And the industry is so big and growing so fast in emerging markets, 2 to 3% market share actually builds a very, very respectable size business. Now you say, well, how do you make money when the big companies are losing money in these very same markets? And the answer is you can't afford a lot of overhead. And so the incumbent companies, whether it's Nokia, HTC, or others, Sony, they tend to have a lot of overhead, not just for engineering, but also just for support, administration of the business. And we said it's got to be incredibly frugal. So you've got to have a frugal expense model. You can't afford to invest in technology. You've got to put together the best partnerships with people who do have those skills, because obviously you need great technology and contract manufacturing. And you make a bet on something really important. We said, we'll make our bet on industrial design. And so that's what we're doing, and it's doing pretty well.
Yeah, it goes back to the same concept. How do you redefine the problem? How do you define it differently? And exactly. I think once you define the problem, then the solution is not so hard. In fact, I think Mitch Cohen talks about producers versus performers. And performers are standard task-oriented, and they're great. They do very well when they do very well. But producers are the ones who take the big risks and often quit their jobs and start something great. And the producers are the people who will experiment with these kind of ideas. So this takes me to the next question on the 800 razor. One would typically think and say, why would you be in the razor blade business?
I love to work with entrepreneurs who have come up with a good idea and are anxious to have some help and are firm believers that they can disrupt an industry. And let's take the razor blade industry. It's dominated by one company, exceptional products, strong market position, which means that they can charge very high prices. If you try the customer experience, because I think everything revolves around customer experience, if you go into a pharmacy and you want to buy razor blades, you have to find somebody in the store who can unlock the glass case that is protecting these very high-priced, very valuable razor blades from being stolen by someone who comes into the store. So it's not a great experience, and it's pretty frustrating when you have to pay so much money to buy a razor blade. So we were able to come up with a guaranteed source of supply with highest quality razor blades, comparable to the market leader. And we put together a very frugal expense company. We're using our skills to understand how do you build brand, how do you build customer loyalty. And we spend a lot of time tweaking, tuning the customer metrics. I'm a big believer that if you want to understand the business, you've got to understand it through the eyes of your customer. That it's all about the customer plan, not the business plan. Business plans tend to be good budgeting exercises. So you look at last year, you say, okay, so I expect to have so much growth the next year, and how can I take the resources I have and spend them smartly? But it's not about building a new company from scratch. The customer plan says, okay, is there something here that the customer would really want? if you sold a razor blade and a razor for half the price of the market leader, would the customers like that? And would the customers rate the quality of your product to be as good as the major competition? So what appealed to me about 800razors.com is that they actually have incredible Net Promoter Score. The Net Promoter Score is based upon the ultimate question, as it's known, which is, would you recommend this product or service to a family member or a friend? You rate it on a 10-point scale.
Right, Frederick Reichels created that concept.
Exactly. And so it comes out that a rating that is in the mid-30s, where AT&T or American Express is pretty typical. But the people at the top of the ratings are people like Southwest Airlines, Apple, Amazon. These are companies that have exceptional ratings, and they're over 60 points. And the way you get to that rating is you sum up the number of people who rate it 9 or 10, 10 being the best, and you subtract it from the people who rated it 6 and below, and the Net Promoter Score is the net of those two numbers, taking the 6 and below from the 9 and 10. And so having over a 60 Net Promoter Score is a really, really good number. Well, it turns out that 800 Razors has a 62 Net Promoter Score, right up there with Apple, with Amazon, with Southwest Airlines. People love the product. They also love the price point. They love the ease at which they can buy it because it's only available online. And so we said, that's pretty interesting. And then we spent a whole year tweaking the customer metrics. What's the cost of customer acquisition? Tweaking the creative. How do we tell the message in the most effective way? What media do we run on and do we have the best conversion rates on? What's the number of dollars that people will have in the first transaction? How frequently will they come back for the second transaction, the third transaction? And how do we retain a customer and not lose them? So we spent a lot of time on the details of the data from those metrics and tweaking them for a year, just trying to find, what is the right way to spend money before we ever even thought about going into an expansion stage for the company. Once we figured that out, we said, okay, we're ready to go. And that's what's happening to the business now, and it's just booming.
Yeah, indeed. And I talked to Phil, and it was an interesting conversation. And by the way, I use straight razors oftentimes, so I suggested you should also have straight razors in there. But is it a huge enough market that you could be disrupting to that extent? Even if they capture 1% of the market share, how big is that?
Well, I think of it this way. What if we built a $100 million business? How much profit could we make with a $100 million business? And we believe that we could drop to the bottom line, probably close to $35 million on a $100 million business. That's pretty good.
That's pretty good.
Then we say, how realistic is we can get to a $100 million revenue business, and how long will it take? And we said, gee, we think we can get there in less than 3 years. And how much capital do we have to invest and put at risk at which stages to get there? So we worked all of those considerations through. And it turns out that it's one of the most attractive companies. I have about 15 different companies. It's one of the most attractive new company opportunities that I've seen. So I'm very excited about it. But it only works when you have a really good CEO running the company. Remember, I don't do the heavy lifting. I don't run the companies anymore. So what I loved about Phil Masiello, who's the founder and CEO, and he has a partner who's also a founder as well, Stephen Crane, that Phil, who is the CEO, is just an exceptional CEO. And he makes really, really good judgment choices. And that is so important when you're building a business. I mean, you've got to be right more often than you're wrong in the decisions you make. And he does it. He's frugal. He's smart. He's hardworking. People like working with him. And we are very, very excited. My brother, David Sculley, and I are working on this together as investors and advisors to Phil. And it's one of the most exciting companies we're involved with.
No, this is wonderful. I mean, I'm really glad that I got a chance to talk with you and to talk about 1-800-Razors as well. Thank you so much, John. I enjoyed the conversation. And
thank you.
Glad that I got a chance to talk with you.
Well, it's been really fun for me too. Thank you.